Firstly, I would like to just reciprocate the thanks because I think they're great opportunities to have people like myself to actually come out to the community and talk about, I think, the research that we do, because it's not until we talk to community that we actually really reach impact. So I kind of just reflect on my week's activities. I was in Sydney in New South Wales Parliament as an expert witness about a waste to energy facility in the western suburbs. Then going down to Canberra to talk about food security, and now I'm here in the Red Centre talking about, you know, waste to energy. But I think, as I said, this is a grassroots sort of mob, and it starts here small, and then my job as research scientist is actually getting into the ears of the politicians so that we can change policy, change things in terms of waste management so projects can actually happen. Now, just a bit of background where I come from the National Centre for Engineering and Agriculture, which is one of 7 research centres at USQ. We're down in Toowoomba, which is on the Darling Downs, probably one of the most fertile places around the country, and we do produce a lot of agricultural products. And within the university, we could be quite close to piggeries, feedlots, prime ag land. And so it's quite a contrast, really, I guess, from what we've been hearing today about the land here or the soils here in Alice Springs. So whilst we have very good fertile soils, we still need to be quite sustainable in terms of our agricultural practice. And basically the NCA, my research centre, is about that. We do work in irrigation, sustainable soils, automation, robotics, which is sort of machine vision in tractors, and my area in energy conservation and management, because it's really important to conserve energy on farm as well as off farm. So that's a bit of my background. I guess I came from a rumen microbiology background, so I've been working in that field for the last 25 years, and so it's a natural transition from one of the most efficient digesters in the cow or sheep stomach to then try to transition that to an anaerobic digester, which is what I'll talk a bit about now. So just some facts about food waste. In Australia, about 4 million tonnes reach landfill per annum. So if we got 25% going into the bins in Alice Springs, you're doing pretty good in comparison. So probably a normal curbside bin would probably amount to about 40% organic waste, but that does include clippings as well. But to look at some figures in terms of globally, food waste attributes to about 7% of greenhouse gas emissions. And greenhouse gases, as you know, are very potent and are responsible for global warming. So it's a direct link to climate change. To put it in perspective, if we gathered all the food waste in the world and we put it together as one big country, it would be emitting the 3rd largest amount of greenhouse gases after US and China. So it's a huge problem, but there is solutions, and those solutions are actually happening as we speak in countries like the US. They're starting to do something about their food waste, because I think they're actually the biggest polluters or the biggest wasters there are. The UK are doing some fantastic job, as is all the other countries. And I know this because I also represent Australia nationally through my work with the International Energy Agency program in bioenergy. And so in about 4 weeks' time, I'll be on a plane to Denmark, and we will sit around a table with 13 other member countries talking about best practice in biogas. And Denmark's probably one of the the most progressive countries in terms of what they're doing with their waste. So that was just some figures around about food waste. And I just wanted to, I'm not sure whether everybody can see this, but I'll go through this. This is what we call a hierarchy. Now we know in a general terms with waste hierarchy, it starts with reduce, reuse, recover, and then we're basically going to landfill. But there's a few other options within our food waste hierarchy. Okay, so in reducing and recovering surplus food, the first thing is to basically reduction at its source. So that means reducing the volume of food waste generated to start with. The second option then, as we come down the food waste hierarchy, is to feed hungry people. That is, donate extra food to food banks, soup kitchens and shelters. Now I'm not sure, but some of you might be aware of the Oz Harvest that was promoted back in April, I think was one of their first things. they're a group down in King's Cross. I think that's where they come out of. And it's basically where people come together to put in their food. And it's all good, it's all in date. And basically people come out to basically pay whatever they think. So whether it's $1, $2, $5. So I think that's a really good example of how we can actually feed the more people in need. The third level is to feed animals. So what we're doing here is diverting food scraps, waste, byproducts to animal feed. So we spoke about getting food waste and giving it to our chooks, our other animals or what have you. We're lucky enough at home. I come on for a 40-acre hobby farm, just 10 minutes from where I go to university in Toowoomba. And between the pig and the chooks and the other things, and the worms, we have a bathtub as well with worms, we don't have any organic waste whatsoever, okay? So that is our third level. Going down the hierarchy, there is the industrial uses. This is where we provide waste oils for rendering and fuel conversion and food scraps for digestion to recover energy. Okay, now that is actually above composting. So there's actually a specific use where you can gather more energy and more food or products, or sorry, food waste to products in the food waste hierarchy, and I'll just mention it a little bit later. So as we said, the recovery of energy and fertiliser is actually above composting. And this is the way that actually food waste is starting to be used in overseas countries, those which are able to have the technology and, might I add, the support in terms of financial support, but we'll talk about that a bit later as well. So as we go down, we got composting. Again, we saw some great work about composting and how we can create nutrient-rich soil amendments out of food scraps. And then at the very bottom, we have landfill and incineration, which is basically your last resort for disposal. Now, here in Australia, we have a lot of space, and so landfill is something that we do a lot of. But there are countries such as Finland who are banning landfill, and there'll be more countries in the EU to follow. So what they end up doing is incinerate that very last tonnage of waste. And incineration is one of those technologies which we talk about in the classification of waste to energy. So basically they're using thermal recovery mechanisms like combustion, simple burning, to then generate electricity. There's also gasification, for those of you who might have heard that term, or pyrolysis. So these are heating the last recoverable bits of rubbish to really high temperature in the absence of oxygen to create a syngas. So they actually use that as well. So they're basically using what we call a circular economy to the greatest effect to extract every last joule of waste to something that is actually going to give them some source of profit. Okay, so what I might do now is talk a little about anaerobic digestion in comparison to what we were shown about in composting, and see the relative difference. So with anaerobic digestion, as you can see it, it's basically organic matter. And it's not an appropriate use for those technologies that we call like combustion, because it's far too wet. So you're not going to get as much energy, or it's the calorific value as we call it in scientific terms. So the food waste basically comes down to these big biogas facilities, and they're put into, first of all, special holding bays, and then put into these big vessels. So they're basically like big tanks, okay? And they can be highly engineered tanks, which cost a fair bit of money, or they can be quite low-cost technology. But for food waste, it's generally into these ones. What happens is that the organic matter in the food waste is broken down via microbes, okay? But it's done in the absence of oxygen. It's why we call it anaerobic digestion. So that's in complete contrast to composting, where we said that the more oxygen that we put into the system and putting in the pitchfork was the better, right? Here we want to have no oxygen whatsoever. So here, the food waste is broken down to a biogas. In those countries which are actually doing food waste, they do actually, what we say is pasteurize, or to kill the microorganisms that are pathogenic or disease causing. And then throughout the process, it's really important to control it. And this is where my discipline knowledge as a microbiologist comes in, because we can't just simply set and forget. We've got to control, and through this constant process monitoring and control, we make sure the conditions are right. Just in the same way that we just don't simply layer our compost and systems and just sit and forget. We really need to control those things. So the product that comes out of anaerobic digestion is a biogas. Now, biogas is about 60 to 70% methane, which is basically like natural gas. The remainder is carbon dioxide, and through special processes which remove it or scrub out the carbon dioxide, we're left with a methane, which can be used to generate electricity through putting it through gensets or generators. So what we'd like to do though, because that conversion of the methane to electricity is not very efficient, it's only around about 42%, we want to increase the efficiency of that conversion, and so what we have is a combined heat and power system, or CHP, so that we're able to use the heat as well. We use that for manufacturing, or we can actually use it to heat homes. So in the Northern Hemisphere, the biogas is very useful to heat homes because it's very cold. The other area that is very useful is actually a direct replacement in natural gas vehicles. So in Sweden, where they have no natural gas resource, 50% of the biogas they produce, I think 60% now, actually is used for vehicles. And so when the first time I got off at Stockholm there and I saw these buses going around running on biogas, and I thought that is amazing. The best we can do in Brisbane, it's like our buses are running on natural gas. Well, it's a start, we start small. So we got three things, and this is why biogas, as one of the many different sorts of bioenergy, is what we call the most flexible form of renewable energy, in that it produces bioelectricity, heat and fuel. But bioenergy is also one of the more, flexible in terms of its market, but also in terms of being dispatchable. So dispatchable, we mean that we can switch it on and off, whereas you can't do that with wind and solar. And it also provides baseload electricity, simply like a coal-fired power station. So biogas can actually play a really important role into our energy mix into the future, in that it's able to provide intermittent supply when the sun doesn't shine and the wind doesn't blow. And so as what we're seeing overseas is that bioenergy is actually becoming quite a large player in the energy mix. So for instance, Sweden and in Finland, that's around about 25% is bioenergy. Yes, a lot of that's burning biomass, but at least they're up there. In Australia, 1.5% in terms of our electricity generation.
We don't have the same political and historical imperative though.
Absolutely.
Because they're really, if they don't do it themselves, then they're subject to coal from Russia. And,
Yeah. Oh, look, it's a very complex picture, but it's all around about, what subsidies they get, what sort of financial incentives as well. And it's also about the abundance of fossil fuels, but we know that that's not going to be there into the future, so we need to act. So that's basically where it's at for in terms of biogas. But the one good thing that we also get from the anaerobic digestion process is the product called the digestate, or the sludge that remains. So whilst we put in all of the food waste into there, at the bottom, where all the microorganisms are doing their bit to turn the food into biogas, they will settle down to the bottom. And in much the same way as you take the castings from your worm bins, you're going to produce digestate, right? Now that is a very nutrient-rich biofertiliser. Now in Australia, we have about 250 biogas plants. Most of them are coming from just simple landfill capture, so I wouldn't really class that as a digester. The other industry that's using it to pretty good effect is the wastewater treatment plants, because they have to do it as part of their treatment processes anyway. We're getting some uptake in piggeries, because they've got to treat their piggery waste, and red meat processors are also leading the charge in terms of industry. But the one thing that is missing in Australia is actually using the digestate, and I think that's where we should be, or where we can actually play a big role in terms of getting it, because as you know, our soils are very poor, and so by producing a very rich or biofertiliser, then we could go some way into creating that. And also it's reducing the need for synthetic fertilisers, which in itself produce greenhouse gases. So it truly is what we call a closed loop system, right? So if we go through the biofertilizers, it's going to help improve the soil and grow plants, which then produce food. So that's our food waste. So very quickly, if I go through the composting, now composting isn't my gig. I'm a microbiologist, but I know enough about the process to just show you basically what the difference is. And as I said before, it's the environment for which the microorganisms are doing their gig. So in anaerobic digestion, there's no air, and in composting, it's really critical to provide the oxygen. So food waste, it's shredded to increase the surface area. And this is what we call in-vessel composting. So it's where you're going to try and get as much of your organic material. So we said a cubic metre is probably about the minimum size that you want. So if you can start to put it in a larger vessel, then you're going to create more. So it's broken down in with oxygen, and we need to control moisture levels, just like we need to control the process monitoring control with the anaerobic digestion. I think there was a question about, you know, when you're working with compost, how important is it to, you know, cover yourself with gloves and the like? I think it's quite important in terms of like the microbial consortium you have is the fungi and the bacteria. So fungi produce spores, and so if you're sort of in amongst it, you're going to inhale them. So you might get some respiratory problems. But again, of course, the cuts and things like that. So we've heard about the cellulitis, but I think also there's some, if you've got horse manure, you're going to have your Clostridium botulinum in there. So tetanus may be another thing, especially if you've got open cuts, so tetanus cuts. The compost is then laid out in piles. It's what we call the windrows, if you're going to do it in a big, large scale. And then it's going to be screened. So then you get this biofertiliser, which is similar, I guess, to the one that's produced in AD, but obviously gone through another process. And again, creates the closed loop that we're after in there. That pretty much is a wrap-up of what the waste to energy is. But in terms of the social, economic and financial benefits for communities, I think you're going to get much more community benefits if it's, you know, coming from a smaller one. And I take this more from looking at the perspective of what happens when developing nations like Africa and India have done in the anaerobic digestion scene. So I did a presentation about a year ago now down at Parliament House in a conference which was all about food security. And there was an example of a community in Uganda who used food waste or their kitchen waste into their small little digesters. So I talked about different scales. So these people had their community digesters so that they were able to bring their food waste. Now for those communities which don't have any lighting or the fuel source is composed of basically gathering wood or having to spend a lot of money on kerosene, the benefits of actually being able to capture the methane from using their kitchen waste is quite large. So in some of those countries you have women who have to spend up to 4 hours to collect firewood, or they spend a lot of money in kerosene or in charcoal. So if you're going to reduce the need or the drudgery for women to actually collect the firewood, that then turns into very much social benefits and also benefits in terms of how they educate their children. So the time that they spend in collecting the firewood is better spent to educate the children. The other thing is that the lighting that they actually use from the biogas is better than the kerosene one, so that the children are able to study up to 2 hours more because they actually have some decent lighting. The other thing, of course, is through burning charcoal, through burning wood in their houses, they are able to reduce respiratory disease which actually occurs from burning of charcoal. So the biogas burns a lot cleaner, so they're going to be a healthier livelihoods. So in terms of impact for those nations, they are very, very large. You'll probably see less and less impacts, obviously, with the the more developed countries. But in Australia, what I'm seeing is the move toward communities starting to take things into their own hands. So for the opportunities for Alice Springs, we don't know what's out there. I think you start small, as I said, if you can engage the council to even just start doing some simple things like providing green waste to do the composting, then you're sort of like about here. Now, whether you actually get up to a bit further to actually use source separation, to use the food organic waste to produce AD, we don't know, but it's the small steps at a time. There are other instances across Australia where we're seeing local governments and indeed state governments taking things into their own hands. So I use an example of Cowra, which is in central New South Wales, regional community, who've been probably doing something or trying to get a waste to energy project up for probably the last 4 years. So certainly not an overnight story. So they've been trying to get interest from their local government, which they actually have. They've got some seed funding from the Cowra Council. They've also got funding from New South Wales government. They went on to ARENA, which is our Australian Renewable Energy Agency, for some funding. They're a little bit harder to crack because they obviously sit under the federal government, but they were managed to get some small funding to demonstrate that what they're doing is right. So what their proposal was essentially was that if they take waste from a number of industries, and whether it's from food waste from restaurants, some waste from abattoirs and piggeries, waste from other areas, and also into the future maybe growing some energy crops so that farmers can also diversify their income. They all come and to a facility where they can actually produce energy and then also use the digestate. So a lovely closed loop system which we can all try to aspire to, but it is happening and the interest is generating as we speak. So on that note, I'd probably call it a close and I'd love to take some questions. Yes, Rachel.
I guess for me, our local landfill site is running out of space. I think, I'm not quite sure, but it's 10 years approximately left in the landfill. And the fact that the landfill is right next to the sewage treatment plant seems like a blessing to me in terms of possibly locating something like this. How do you use the sewage in a system like that?
That's a really good question, Rachel, because the way that traditionally these are set up overseas, and this is one I visited in the Netherlands in April this year, is that we call co-locating the waste management facility next to a wastewater treatment plant. So during the treatment of sewage, they produce what we call a sludge, which is what we talked about, the bottom bit there, and they need to get rid of that. And so through a process, it's what we call waste activated sludge, they need to get rid of it, and it's through anaerobic digestion. So that actually sort of starts as a bit of a feed base. And then, as Costa said, and I really like the term because I keep saying that to my students even, is that diversity is the best thing. You know, you can add all of these, what we call augmented little chemicals or whatever, but it's about adding all these food groups. It's a bit, your digester, or that digester is no different to your stomach. And we find that we try, at lab scale, we will feed our digesters heavy with fats, oils and greases from abattoir wastewater just to see how far we can push them. And they'll topple over, they'll just what we say overload and they'll get sick. So to bring in like the waste activated sludge, and then other sources of waste streams, whether it's through, or the organic waste through food waste from the landfill to divert, or from other industry. Now I know in Alice Springs you don't have a big ag sector, so you don't sort of have the same sort of things that we do. Agricultural sectors. So what sort of things do, because so cows, camels, I know, that's, but it's all about how do you harvest that feedstock, because this is an example of, we did a funded project from Meat and Livestock Australia, so we've got lots and lots of feedlots in Queensland, and they produce a lot of waste.
We don't have a feedlot.
No, we don't have feedlots, but the thing is that we can't even use our feedlot manure because of the harvesting. So the animals come in, they're on these pads, and the manure is scraped off from these box scrapers, right? And so what you try and do is minimise any grit and soil, because that's all inorganic. You want to introduce as much organic material to produce the most amount of methane. And so because the box scrapers come in and they bring up all this stuff, they've got grit and material, and so that decreases the amount of methane that you can get off livestock manure from feedlots. The other thing is that not all your feedlotters are going to be vigilant in picking up manure. So in our term, fresh is best too, because the more organic material there is, it will be when it's fresh, because sitting down on the ground, what volatilizes, all the organics goes off. And so if they're going to leave it on a feedlot pad for 3 months, it's not going to be as good, and so your methane levels. So harvesting is really important. So I'd like to know how your camels are kept, probably roaming around free.
They are, but your cattle industry is like one of the biggest contributors to our economy.
Yeah.
So it's a massive resource.
Yep.
I don't know
Untapped. Yep.
How you harvest it.
Yep.
But from a natural resource point
Yeah.
of view.
Yeah. So in terms of where Australia sits, we've got a huge ag sector, and that's where a lot of our interest is being driven, but it's all about how do we capture it, because we have other negatives in terms of our dispersed geographic locations, and it's about how do we get all these in at minimal cost. The other issues we face is probably a government which is only just starting to get in terms of renewables. The fact that we didn't have a renewable energy target for a long time actually impacted heavily even on our bioenergy sector, if not solar and wind. So it's coming together to meet those targets. I mean, you might be aware of the clean energy target now from the Finkel review. That's causing all sorts of other different things in terms of what we need to be looking at is the policies about decarbonising. Because if we have policies set in terms of decarbonising, then this is going to be a win-win, because you're going to generate energy displacing fossil fuels, but you're also going to reduce greenhouse gases which are emitted from the organic decomposition of the waste.
Fossil fuels are too cheap.
Absolutely. This is our problem.
We have. If we double the price of fossil fuel overnight, then all of a sudden things like this could be viable.
Yeah. Yes and no, but diesel goes up and down like this as well. And so like in the ag sector, which we work with, we can say, be very reactive and say, so the prices for diesel, and so they're running around saying we need to look at more energy efficient things. But it's being looked at. So I've been working with Australian gas networks in South Australia, and they're looking at topping up things as well. So it's the interest is there. We are actually, I learned this the other day, a net energy importer. Right? Yeah. So
that's why they're getting inside like things like fracking and things like that, because of the potential use of that. It's a very topical issue at the moment.
absolutely, yep. And it's what we're looking for is those alternate ways where we can actually produce green gas, right? So this is what we call green gas. So in countries like even Ireland, so I have a good colleague in our our task leader in the IEA. Ireland has a huge gas network, and they're only just looking at how they're greening the gas network. And in much the same way, I think we will get there too. And for me, this is why it's a really interesting time for me to be at this point of research, because it's so purposive, like it's immediate and it's happening as we speak. And so we will get there, and I think the various pressures are there. And to be talking to people in state government who say to me, so what do you recommend? And I say, well, put this on the agenda, and they'll change the legislation to suit if you can actually be able to communicate that. But the fact they're starting to put it out there, doing these inquiries, wanting to know expert opinions, means that it's slowly getting out there. Yep.
Yeah, I've just got two questions. I mean, I just missed part of your presentation, but I'm interested if you said in Kenya they've got some sort of similar, like they have a small scale system. I mean, I'm just interested, what would it actually cost to sort of do something like a system in Alice Springs, and what would you know? And governments usually they look at the cost, they look at the benefits, and they have the political sway as well. So I suppose we're the political sort of sway, or the the swell from the community. But I'm just interested what it would actually cost, yeah, and how you actually use that as a bit of a lever, some extra leverage to be able to sort of swing them.
Yeah. So looking at your CBAs or your cost benefit analysis is your first thing in determining the feasibility of a project. But it also is about how do you influence to actually get some financial support. It depends on your technology, but say for example, before we had the emissions reduction fund, you might be aware of the ERF. That's our best way that we can actually get some sort of demonstrating reduction of emissions, right? And they actually get some credit units. Before that, we had the carbon farming initiative, where the piggery industry was able to put in these lagoons to treat their pig waste and cover with high density polyethylene covers. And so they were able to demonstrate that their emissions were being reduced because the natural degradation of the pig waste would reduce greenhouse gases. And they'd get AQs, or Australian Carbon Credit Units. So you can get some credits. Now, the only way possible these days, it seems, because the ERF isn't a mechanism that enables that support back. It's around about looking at your own industry or your own business. So for example, I work with the third largest meat processor in Australia, Oki Beef Exports, who did some back of the envelope figures, and $10 million investment was worked out that if they treat their wastewater with this investment to produce methane, which they can then supplement in their natural gas-fired boilers to use on site, they would be able to have a payback in about 5 years.
Wow.
But, you know, with that, it's a first of its kind technology and there's a bit of teething issues, but the fact is that they have to go in there and do a business case. So really, because of the way the landscape is and that we're not getting a lot of subsidy, and feed-in tariffs are next to nothing, you have to start to look at it and how do you recoup those costs by using the methane to generate your own electricity or replace a fossil fuel like natural gas in your system. So make it...
potential analysis, because we've got a sewage plant out there that for human waste that produces massive amounts of methane, which is far more dangerous than CO2.
25 times more potent.
Yeah, which means that we've got the potential, we've got gas-fired power stations they're talking about putting in down the road. To me, it's logical, collect that methane, stick it in the...
Yeah, and if you see, when Rachel was talking about the wastewater treatment plant and what was the potential for that, and I said, well, it is, but it depends on the technology that WWTP is using. So if it's using biological nutrient removal, or if it's aerobic and it doesn't have anaerobic digestion to treat it, then it's not going to produce the sludge. So it'd be interesting to see what they do.
What is the emissions that you get from burning the biofuel after it's been...
So it's a clean.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What happens to methane when you burn it?
So it's gone. So yeah, so it's burning free cleanly, and the emissions, yeah. Oh, I'm trying to think, yeah. No, it just gets transferred. But, you know, carbon dioxide is a lot less. I mean,
It's less worse.
yeah, 25 times less. But it's like when, you know, anything goes through a transitioning period. So when even the piggery industry was going through installing anaerobic ponds and covering them to capture the methane, to then put into their gen sets to convert to electricity, or even they use the heat to go and heat in the sow, with the sows to heat the floor for the piglets. The generators weren't sized appropriately, and so they'd flare a lot of it. So that's a waste there. But that's because they just got to understand how to appropriately size the generators. Yeah?
Speaking of joining with generators, would there be any requirement to change the generator sets for, in this case, our generator for Alice Springs, combining both methane and natural gas in the...
Yep, it's happening. I only read about it in Adelaide somewhere. It was on my feed just yesterday.
It actually feed both in and it'll burn without a problem.
You know, was that one there? I think it is, because it's like the natural gas and the biogas.
Yep.
And this is exactly what they're doing at Oki Beef Exports. So up to around about, they've designed it so 45% of their natural gas needs is being supplemented by the biogas that's being produced from the treatment of their wastewater. And yes, yeah, because it's the same product. Actually, no, the first thing I was talking about was another technology about some other synergy between, I think, landfill could have been. But yes, indeed, and this is the beauty about using biogas to replace natural gas, because you don't have to scrub out the mainly the H2S, or the hydrogen sulfide, which is very corrosive to your gensets, and that costs money to get in the iron chloride, and the CO2 is easily removed through water scrubbers, things.
Might have time for 2 more questions, but just to warmly invite you all tomorrow. We've also got a workshop with Bernadette. I'm not sure what time, if anyone's got a program.
Is it 11:30?
11:30, is it? Yeah, in the Seniors Over 50 Centre. So if you want to drill down a little bit more detail than we have today and look at some of the barriers locally and some of the ways we can overcome them, that would be great to have you there. Were there a couple of more questions?
Yeah.
Given that we've got a council election coming up very soon and a couple of candidates at least here, what is there? How would you suggest we lobby them, or what would we ask for, or if we want to see more of this?
Look, I think from what I've heard today when we did the little tour around the gardens is generally have a look at what their waste strategy plan is. So I say that from my own area of council, so Toowoomba Regional Council went through an exercise where they developed their own waste strategy plan, and in that they will have to set targets in terms of how they're going to go and process their waste. What are their levels of recycling? Look at that, the waste hierarchy. What amount can they, reducing is up to us, but how do they recover the most? Because that's going to be the easiest. But then as we come down, what are we doing in terms of recovering? And I think it's about holding to account about the waste strategy, right? But then further up, start other areas. So we need to get a marriage between waste management facilities, water utilities, and energy. So it's when you get those 3 together, talking on the same page, that I think things can happen.
We have gone out to tender for, the council has, for curbside recycling, but they didn't go out for a curbside organic. So to me, even collecting it for either of these options, to me, I just think it would be...
Well, that's one starting to be easier one,
that would be
composting.
Easier option, but it would be good to divert our food waste. And Costa, did you have a question?
Yeah, it's interesting because, you're talking about a resource that requires a lot of community education. And I suppose my question is that there's certain signals that can be given out that are literally saying continue down the same path of a level of consumption and convenience. How do you sort of marry that into these strategies that you're talking about? Because I know there's been French pre-permaculturalist Jean Penny was driving around with biogas on the roof of his car back in the 40s.
Yeah.
When I look at the education involved in getting a green waste project set up,
Yep.
to see it hijacked perhaps as a way of dealing with waste, to say let's just keep going with what we're doing. I see a very fine line between those two examples on the board, because we don't want to say, particularly to certain elements of big industry, this is a carte blanche.
Yep.
Keep doing what you're doing.
Yep. It's not business as usual, no.
Yeah.
And I tell you what, it's basically drivers. And I'm looking at EU, right, for example. It's basically, they have, as you mentioned, different drivers, it's energy and things like that. But it's also, if you look from a waste management point of view, if they're banning landfill, this is our thing we need to do, is that you don't have any other option to do business as usual. So as I mentioned right down here, when you've got it, last resort is landfill. Well, if they don't even have that, they've got incineration, right? Now, incineration is actually a good thing, because you're actually generating anything that's going to be done in the land to actually some useful product, which is energy anyway. So I think there really just needs to have to be, unfortunately, sticks instead of carrots, right? But where else can you go? So if you look at how those countries have transitioned, we're young, right? 200 odd years, and this is what we've done already. I meant in terms of, you know, the 40,000 before is that lived in harmony, right? But when we're here for the 200 years, we have done quite an impact. We've made an impact. But you're looking at countries in Europe, in the US, or, you know, Europe mainly, what they've done is that they've been forced to have to go down that period, or that transitioning of things, because they had to been doing business as usual, right? And it's only because we have the luxury of land space available, fuel prices are quite cheap, that we don't have the same things. But if you get the communication out there, I think that hopefully that would win over things. But also it's about Australia, you know, COP21, Paris Agreement, we've signed up. But we need to also say, well, our drivers are different, but if you work as a collective, you know, countries, we need to get on board. And so we were held account, you know, I think.
Thank you. I'd like everyone to thank Bernadette for her.
Thank you.